Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most tragic and intense chapters in the entire first book of Samuel. We're talking about chapter 31, the final, grim conclusion to the reign of King Saul, Israel's very first king. And believe me, it's a story packed with desperation, prophecy, and, right at the end, a really surprising act of honor. You know, the chapter gives us this incredibly blunt summary, right in the middle of all the chaos. It just says, "So Saul died, and all his men, that same day, together." Wow. Just like that. But to really feel the weight of those words, we've got to rewind and see how everything completely fell apart on that fateful day. All right, so the story kicks off on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. Israel's in this huge battle with their old enemies, the Philistines. And, well, it is not going well for them at all. The Israelite army is just completely breaking apart. The scripture says they fled and fell down slain. So this isn't a battle anymore, it's a rout. A total slaughter. You have to imagine the lines are broken, and Israel's soldiers are just being cut down as they're trying to escape. It's a scene of complete and total military collapse. So the Philistines, they can smell victory, right? They press their advantage, and they start to zero in on the king himself. And in all that chaos, something absolutely devastating happens to the royal family. Saul's 3 sons, Jonathan, who was his heir and David's best friend, plus Abinadab and Melchishua, they're all killed. Just like that, the entire royal line is shattered in a single afternoon. And then the defeat becomes deeply personal for Saul. The battle turns squarely against him. He gets targeted by the Philistine archers, and an arrow finds its mark. Suddenly, the king is critically wounded all alone on the battlefield. So now Saul is cornered, he's wounded, and he's facing the absolute humiliation of being captured. He knows his reign is over, his life is over, and he's left with one final desperate choice. He turns to his armor-bearer and gives him this just horrifying command. He begs him, "Lest these uncircumcised come and abuse me." And you got to understand, for Saul, uncircumcised wasn't just some casual term. It meant they were pagan enemies, outside of God's covenant. He would literally rather die by the hand of his own man than be captured, tortured, and paraded as a trophy. His fear of dishonor was way greater than his fear of death. But his armor-bearer just can't do it. The text says he was sore afraid. And he wasn't just scared of the king. He was terrified of the idea of what he was being asked to do. He couldn't bring himself to strike down the Lord's anointed, the man that God himself had chosen to lead Israel. That reverence just paralyzed him. So, with his last request refused, Saul knows what he has to do. He takes his own sword, plants it in the ground, and falls on it. Right there on the battlefield, the first king of Israel dies by his own hand. What a tragic and lonely end. And this next part just shows you the incredible depth of loyalty back then. Seeing that his king is dead, the armor-bearer immediately does the same thing. He falls on his own sword, choosing to die right there with his master rather than live on without him. Now, this devastating end on Mount Gilboa, it wasn't just some random tragedy of war. If you look at it from a theological point of view, this was actually the final, inevitable outcome of a path Saul had chosen years and years before. And that brings us to the big question of Saul's whole story, right? I mean, this was the guy chosen by God, anointed by the prophet Samuel, loved by the people. So how in the world did his reign end in such a complete and utter disaster? Well, the answer was actually given to him years earlier by the prophet Samuel. See, this wasn't a sudden fall from grace. It was a long, slow decline that started when Saul just kept choosing his own ideas over God's direct commands. The big turning point was after a battle with the Amalekites. God said destroy everything, but Saul spared their king and the best of the livestock. And that's when Samuel laid it out for him. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. So this whole disaster on the battlefield, it's the direct fulfillment of that prophecy. Saul's story really becomes this stark warning about what happens when a leader disobeys. His kingdom wasn't just lost in battle. It was literally taken from him because of his actions, exactly like Samuel had said it would be. Okay, so Israel's leadership is completely wiped out, and the Philistines have won. But they're not just content with winning. Oh, no. They're about to inflict the ultimate shame on Israel and their fallen king. The day after the battle, they find the bodies of Saul and his sons. And what they do next is it's a calculated act of pure desecration. They cut off Saul's head, they strip his armor and put it on display in their pagan temple like a trophy, and then they nail his headless body to the city wall of Beth-shan for everyone to see. I mean, you can't get more dishonorable than that.
But just when the story hits rock bottom, a little glimmer of light appears from a totally unexpected place. A single act of incredible courage and honor rises up right from the ashes of this huge defeat.
The news of what happened to Saul's body spreads, and it reaches this town called Jabesh-Gilead. And this is important because these people, they had a long memory. Way back at the beginning of Saul's reign, he had saved their city from a really cruel enemy. It was his first big act as king, and they never forgot it.
So the valiant men of the city, they decide they just can't let this disgrace stand. They launch this incredibly risky secret mission, traveling all night deep into enemy territory. They manage to get the bodies of Saul and his sons down from the wall, bring them all the way back home, and give them a proper funeral. They burn the bodies, probably to make sure no one could desecrate them again, and then bury the bones under a tree. And then they mourn publicly for 7 days, giving their fallen king the honor and death that his enemies tried to deny it.
So let's wrap this up. As we look back at 1 Samuel 31, what are the big takeaways from this powerful, tragic story? What does the end of Saul's reign really teach us?
Well, this story really hammers home a few crucial themes. First, you see the severe consequences of disobedience to God. No question about that. It also underscores that God has the final say, his sovereignty over life, death, and entire kingdoms. But then, through the men of Jabesh-Gilead, we see something else. The incredible importance of honor, even when someone has failed. It's a powerful statement about the huge weight and responsibility of leadership. And that leaves us with one last, really challenging question to think about. Saul's life ended in tragedy, right? A direct result of his disobedience. But the story doesn't end with his shame. It ends with the courage of men who chose to honor him anyway, despite all his failures. And it makes you ask, what does true honor really look like in the face of failure? This story seems to suggest that honor isn't just for the winners. It's a light that can shine even in the absolute darkest of moments.